Within the administrative and ceremonial structure of the Ottoman Empire, the imperial household functioned not merely as a domestic space, but as a central institution of governance. The inner court, often referred to as the imperial harem, was governed by rigid hierarchies, codified expectations, and systems of discipline that mirrored the broader political order. Women within this environment, particularly those who rose to the status of royal consorts or legal wives, occupied positions that were both influential and precarious. Their proximity to placed them at the intersection of intimacy and authority, where favor could translate into power and suspicion could result in severe consequences. Historical records indicate that accusations of treason within the Ottoman court were rarely limited to overt acts of rebellion. Instead, they were often framed within a broader understanding of loyalty to the state. For royal wives, this loyalty extended beyond personal fidelity. It encompassed their conduct, alliances, patronage networks, and even the political ambitions attributed to them through association with factions within the palace. Surviving documents suggest that the mechanisms through which such accusations were investigated were neither transparent nor standardized. Unlike formal judicial proceedings conducted in the empire's courts, matters concerning the imperial household were typically handled internally. They retained ultimate authority, though influential court officials, such as the chief eunuch or senior members of the imperial council, could play advisory roles. This concentration of power meant that outcomes were often shaped by court dynamics rather than consistent legal principles. Contemporary accounts describe how royal women were embedded within complex networks of influence. These networks included servants, scribes, eunuchs, and external political actors who sought to gain favor or advance specific interests. Within such a system, the line between political engagement and perceived subversion could become indistinct. A royal wife who supported a particular administrative faction or maintained correspondence with external figures might later find those same actions reinterpreted as evidence of disloyalty. Chroniclers noted that one of the most sensitive issues within the imperial household was succession. The absence of a fixed law of primogeniture meant that multiple princes could be considered legitimate heirs. This uncertainty fostered an environment in which maternal influence carried significant weight. Royal wives, particularly those who bore sons, were often understood to act in the interests of their children. While such behavior was expected to a degree, it also rendered them vulnerable to accusations that they were attempting to manipulate the succession process. Legal codes of the period reveal that treason, in its broadest sense, was defined as any action perceived to threaten the authority or the stability of the state. However, the application of this concept within the harem was shaped more by precedent and political necessity than by explicit statute. In practice, this meant that similar actions could result in markedly different outcomes depending on the broader context. In some documented cases, accusations against royal wives emerged during periods of political instability. Times of military defeat, economic strain, or administrative conflict often heightened sensitivities within the court. Surviving correspondence suggests that during such periods, and his advisors were more likely to interpret internal dissent as part of a broader pattern of. Royal wives who might otherwise have been protected by their status could become targets of suspicion if their perceived loyalties were questioned. The methods of punishment for those found guilty or deemed too politically dangerous to remain within the palace varied. Historical evidence indicates that exile was one of the more common outcomes. In such instances, the accused woman would be removed from the imperial court and relocated to a provincial residence or another controlled environment. While this allowed the state to neutralize potential influence, it also served to avoid the public repercussions that might accompany more severe penalties. However, exile did not necessarily imply leniency. Contemporary accounts describe how exiled royal women often experienced significant restrictions on movement, communication, and access to resources. Their households were reduced, their ability to maintain patronage networks was curtailed, and their visibility within the political sphere effectively eliminated. In this sense, exile functioned as both a punishment and a preventative measure. In more severe cases, particularly where accusations were tied to succession disputes or alleged conspiracies, execution could occur. Chroniclers noted that such actions were carried out with discretion, often within the confines of the palace itself. The methods employed were designed to avoid public spectacle, reflecting a broader Ottoman preference for maintaining the dignity of the ruling institution even in moments of discipline. It is important to note that the evidentiary standards applied in these cases were not consistent with modern legal expectations. Surviving documents suggest that decisions were frequently based on a combination of testimony, rumor, and the own assessment of risk. The absence of a formalized investigative process meant that outcomes could be influenced by personal relationships, court rivalries, and shifting political priorities. The role of the chief black eunuch, who oversaw the imperial harem, appears prominently in several accounts. As the intermediary between the and the women of the court, this official possessed significant informational control. Contemporary sources indicate that reports, complaints, and allegations often passed through this office, giving it substantial influence over how situations were presented to them. This position could therefore shape the trajectory of an accusation, either amplifying concerns or mitigating them. Economic factors also played a role in the dynamics of accusation and punishment. Royal wives controlled considerable wealth through stipends, gifts, and endowments. These resources enabled them to support religious institutions, charitable works, and networks of dependents. While such activities were generally encouraged, they also created channels through which influence could be exercised. In periods of heightened scrutiny, financial transactions could be reinterpreted as evidence of unauthorized alliances or improper conduct. Surviving architectural records and Waqf documents reveal that some royal women who fell from favor had previously been significant patrons of public works. Their sudden removal from the court could disrupt these, leaving lasting on the communities that depended on their support. This underscores the broader social impact of internal palace decisions, extending beyond the immediate of the imperial household. The psychological dimension of these experiences is more difficult to reconstruct, given the limitations of the sources. However, contemporary accounts occasionally to the atmosphere of uncertainty within the harem. The constant presence of surveillance, combined with the high stakes of court politics, created an environment in which caution was essential. Royal wives were expected to navigate this landscape with precision, balancing personal relationships with the demands of political prudence. Chroniclers also noted that accusations of treason were not always permanent in their consequences. In certain cases, changes in the political climate or the favor could lead to partial rehabilitation. Exiled women might be granted improved conditions, restored allowances, or even limited reintegration into court life. These reversals highlight the fluid nature of power within the Ottoman system, where outcomes were rarely final and could shift in response to evolving circumstances. At the same time, the memory of accusation often persisted. Even when formal penalties were reduced, the associated stigma could limit a woman's ability to re-establish her previous influence. Surviving correspondence suggests that trust, once compromised, was difficult to fully restore within the tightly controlled environment of the imperial court. The treatment of royal wives accused of treason thus reflects a broader pattern within the Ottoman governance structure. A reliance on centralized authority, flexible interpretation of law, and pragmatic responses to perceived threats. Their experiences were shaped not only by their individual actions, but by the wider political context in which those actions were judged. As later records would continue to suggest, these dynamics were neither static nor uniform, but evolved alongside the empire itself, adapting to shifts in administrative practice, external pressure, and internal reform. As the administrative structure of the Ottoman Empire evolved across the 16th and 17th centuries, the position of royal women within the imperial household became increasingly institutionalized. This period, often associated with what modern historians describe as the Sultanate of Women, saw the formal recognition of certain as political actors whose influence extended beyond the confines of the palace. Surviving documents suggest that this transformation did not reduce the associated with accusations of treason. Rather, it redefined the conditions under which such accusations could arise. Contemporary accounts describe how figures such as Hurrem Sultan and Kozum Sultan operated within a framework that combined maternal authority, economic patronage, and political negotiation. Their correspondence, endowments, and recorded interventions in state matters reveal a system in which influence was both acknowledged and monitored. The same mechanisms that enabled their prominence, access to the control over resources and connections to administrative elites, also exposed them to scrutiny. Chroniclers noted that as royal became more visibly engaged in governance, the language used to describe their actions shifted. Activities that might previously have been framed as household management were increasingly interpreted through a political lens. For example, the appointment of officials, the distribution of gifts, or the of particular factions could be understood as attempts to shape policy or succession. In such an environment, the threshold for suspicion was lowered, and the distinction between accepted influence and alleged subversion became more difficult to maintain. Legal administrative records from the period indicate that accusations of treason against royal wives were often entangled with broader struggles within the imperial court. The imperial council, known as the divan, remained the formal of decision-making, but its deliberations were influenced by information originating from multiple sources, including the harem. Reports transmitted through intermediaries could be reframed as intelligence concerning loyalty or, particularly when they aligned with existing rivalries. Surviving correspondence suggests that rival factions sometimes used accusations strategically. By casting a royal woman's actions as disloyal, opponents could weaken her position and, by extension, the prospects of her allies. This practice did not necessarily require fabricated evidence. Rather, it often involved the selective interpretation of real events. A gift to a provincial governor, for instance, could be presented as a routine act of patronage or as an attempt to secure political allegiance, depending on the perspective of the observer. The case of Turhan Sultan provides insight into the volatile nature of these dynamics. Contemporary sources describe her early years in the palace as marked by competition with established figures, including Kozum Sultan. Although the conflict between them is more commonly associated with struggles for regency rather than explicit accusations of treason, the underlying mechanisms were similar. Each side sought to frame the other's actions in terms that would justify intervention by the or his advisors. In such contexts, the boundary between political rivalry and allegations of disloyalty was often indistinct. Historical records indicate that when accusations did escalate to formal consequences, the process remained largely internal. The absence of public trials meant that outcomes were communicated through actions rather than declarations. An abrupt change in residence, a reduction in household staff, or the reassignment of resources could signal a shift in status. For observers within the court, these changes were understood as indicators of favor or disfavor, even in the absence of explicit explanation. In more severe cases, where the perceived threat intersected with questions of succession or regency, the response could be decisive. Chroniclers describe how the removal of a royal woman from the palace, whether through exile or execution, was often accompanied by measures aimed at dismantling her network of influence. Servants and associates could be reassigned, correspondence intercepted, and financial endowments placed under supervision. These were designed to prevent any of the alleged threat. Economic documentation from the period highlights the significance of confiscation as a tool of control. While not universally applied, the seizure or redirection of a royal woman's wealth could serve both punitive and strategic purposes. By limiting access to resources, the state reduced the capacity for independent action while also redistributing assets to reinforce loyalty elsewhere. This practice reflects a broader Ottoman approach in which economic measures were integrated into the management of political risk. The spatial organization of the imperial palace also played a role in the enforcement of these decisions. Architectural studies of Topkapi Palace reveal a layout designed to regulate movement and communication. The separation of quarters, control of access, and reliance on intermediaries created an environment in which surveillance was both practical and systematic. Within this setting, the ability of a royal wife to maintain connections depended on her position within the hierarchy and the degree of trust she retained. Contemporary observers, including foreign envoys and travelers, occasionally commented on the opacity of these processes. Their accounts, while sometimes shaped by external assumptions, consistently emphasized the limited visibility of internal palace affairs. Decisions concerning royal women were rarely disclosed in detail, reinforcing the perception of the imperial household as a space governed by its own. This lack of transparency contributed to an atmosphere in which rumor and interpretation played a significant role. Surviving legal opinions and administrative correspondence suggest that the concept of justice within the harem was closely tied to the preservation of order rather than the adjudication of individual rights. The S responsibility was understood in terms of maintaining stability, and actions taken against members of the household were justified on this basis. In practice, this meant that even unverified suspicions could prompt intervention if they were deemed to pose a sufficient risk. At the same time, not all accusations resulted in irreversible outcomes. Records to instances in which royal women were able to negotiate their positions, either directly or through intermediaries. Appeals to the expressions of loyalty and the strategic use of patronage could influence the final decision. These interactions underscore the importance of negotiation within the Ottoman political system, where authority was centralized but not entirely unresponsive to persuasion. The lived realities of those accused were shaped by this combination of authority and negotiation. Exile, for example, could vary in its severity depending on the imposed. Some women retained limited households and access to correspondence, allowing them to maintain a degree of social presence. Others experienced more restrictive conditions, with minimal contact beyond their immediate attendants. In these arrangements reflects the absence of a standardized framework and the reliance on discretionary judgment. Chroniclers also noted the role of time in altering outcomes. As political circumstances changed, the perceived threat associated with a particular individual could diminish. In such cases, restrictions might be eased and previously imposed penalties reconsidered. However, this process was not guaranteed, and many remained in altered conditions for extended periods. The broader implications of these practices extended beyond the individuals directly involved. The treatment of royal wives accused of treason served as a precedent within the court, shaping expectations and it reinforced the understanding that proximity to power carried inherent risks, and that influence, while attainable, was subject to constant evaluation. In examining these patterns, surviving documents suggest that the Ottoman approach to internal dissent was characterized by flexibility and pragmatism. Rather than adhering to fixed procedures, the system adapted to the specific circumstances of each case, balancing the need for stability with the realities of court politics. This adaptability, while effective in maintaining control, also contributed to the unpredictability experienced by those within the imperial household. As the empire moved into later periods marked by administrative reform and external pressure, these dynamics would continue to evolve, reflecting broader changes in governance and the shifting role of the imperial court. By the 18th and 19th centuries, administrative reforms and changing political pressures began to alter the internal dynamics of the Ottoman Empire. While the imperial household remained of symbolic authority, its direct influence over state affairs gradually diminished in relation to an expanding bureaucratic system. Surviving documents suggest that this shift affected not only the scope of power available to royal women, but also the manner in which accusations, particularly those framed as treason, were interpreted and addressed. Contemporary administrative records indicate that as governance became more formalized, the language of accusation increasingly reflected bureaucratic concerns rather than purely dynastic anxieties. Allegations against royal wives were less frequently tied to overt struggles over succession and more often associated with issues such as unauthorized correspondence, irregularities, or perceived interference in administrative matters. While these concerns still fell under the broad definition of disloyalty, they were now evaluated within a framework that emphasized institutional. Chroniclers of the period noted that the authority, though still absolute in principle, was exercised with greater reliance on advisory bodies and documented procedure. This did not result in a transparent judicial process for members of the imperial household, but it did introduce additional layers of review. Reports concerning alleged misconduct were more likely to be recorded, circulated among officials, and assessed in relation to existing regulations. In this context, accusations against royal wives were embedded within a wider administrative discourse. The physical and social environment of the imperial court also underwent significant transformation. With the gradual, from Topkapi Palace to residences such as Dolmabahce Palace, the spatial organization of shifted. Architectural historians note that these newer palaces were designed to reflect changing conceptions of governance, incorporating elements that facilitated diplomatic interaction and administrative coordination. Within this setting, the relative isolation of the harem was reduced, though not eliminated, altering the mechanisms of oversight and control. Surviving correspondence suggests that royal women continued to engage in patronage and charitable activity, often through formally registered endowments. However, these activities were now subject to increased scrutiny by state officials. Financial records, which had previously been managed within the palace with limited external oversight, became more closely integrated into broader fiscal systems. As a result, actions that might once have been interpreted as customary patronage could now be evaluated in terms of compliance with administrative standards. In cases where accusations arose, the preferred response appears to have shifted toward containment rather than elimination. Exile remained a primary tool, but its implementation was more frequently accompanied by documented. Royal women removed from the court were often assigned specific residences, stipends, and conditions governing their communication. These arrangements were recorded in administrative registers, reflecting an effort to standardize what had previously been a largely discretionary practice. Historical records indicate that execution, while not entirely absent, became less common as a response to accusations against royal wives. This change can be understood within the broader context of Ottoman reform, which sought to align certain aspects of governance with evolving legal and diplomatic norms. The preservation of dynastic dignity, always a consideration, was now reinforced by an increased awareness of external observation, particularly from European powers. Foreign envoys and observers, whose accounts survive in diplomatic archives, frequently commented on these. Their writings suggest that the treatment of members of the imperial household was increasingly viewed as indicative of the empire's internal. While such observations were shaped by external perspectives, they nonetheless contributed to a context in which overtly severe measures carried potential reputational costs. At the same time, the internal logic of the Ottoman system continued to prioritize stability. Surviving documents reveal that when royal wives were perceived as posing a significant, whether through association with dissenting factions or through actions interpreted as of accepted boundaries, intervention remained decisive. The difference lay less in the existence of punishment than in its form and documentation. The role of intermediaries persisted, though their functions adapted to the changing environment. Palace officials, including senior eunuchs and administrative clerks, continued to serve as conduits of information. However, their reports were increasingly integrated into formal channels, where they could be compared with other sources and assessed in relation to policy. This development introduced a degree of procedural consistency, even as ultimate authority remained centralized. Surviving personal accounts from this period, though limited, to the continued uncertainty experienced by royal women. The presence of written regulations did not eliminate the influence of personal relationships or court politics. Instead, it added another layer to an already complex system, in which outcomes depended on both formal criteria and informal negotiation. The consequences of accusation extended beyond immediate punishment. Administrative records show that the reputations of those accused were often preserved in official documentation, influencing how they were perceived in subsequent years. Even when conditions of exile were moderated or allowances restored, the existence of recorded allegations could limit opportunities for renewed influence. This reflects a gradual shift toward a more archival conception of authority, in which written records played an enduring role. Economic also remained significant. The reassignment of resources associated with a royal woman, whether through direct confiscation or through the redirection of endowments, continued to serve as of governance. However, these actions were now more likely to be justified within a framework of fiscal responsibility, rather than solely as measures of political control. This dual rationale illustrates the integration of older practices into a changing administrative context. Chroniclers and later historians have noted that by the late 19th century, the political role of the imperial harem had diminished considerably. The centralization of authority within ministries and the increasing influence of constitutional movements reduced the capacity of royal women to shape state affairs directly. In this environment, accusations of treason against them became less central to the functioning of the political system. Yet, the legacy of earlier practices persisted in institutional memory. The mechanisms developed over centuries, surveillance, controlled communication, discretionary punishment, remained embedded within the administrative culture. Even as their application evolved, they continued to inform how was understood and exercised within the empire. Surviving documents from the final decades of Ottoman rule suggest a gradual redefinition of loyalty itself. Where earlier periods emphasized personal allegiance to the Later reforms increasingly framed loyalty in terms of adherence to law and participation in state institutions. This conceptual shift had implications for how accusations were formulated and evaluated, including those involving members of the imperial household. In examining the full trajectory of these developments, historical evidence indicates that the experiences of royal wives accused of treason were shaped by a combination of continuity and change. The underlying imperative, to protect the stability of the authority of the ruler, remained constant. However, the methods through which this imperative was pursued adapted to evolving political, social, and administrative conditions. The resulting pattern is one of gradual transformation rather than abrupt transition. Early reliance on discretionary authority and internal management gave way, over time, to a more documented and procedurally informed approach. Yet, at each stage, the balance between formal regulation and practical necessity continued to define outcomes. What emerges from the surviving record is not a single, uniform experience, but a spectrum shaped by context. Some royal women navigated accusations and retained a measure of influence, while others were permanently removed from the of power. Their trajectories reflect the broader complexities of the Ottoman system, in which governance operated through a combination of established practice, negotiated authority, and adaptive response. In this sense, the treatment of royal wives accused of treason offers a focused lens through which to understand the inner workings of an imperial structure that, across centuries, sought to maintain continuity while responding to the demands of change.